Jaxar Xylo stood on the bridge of the stalwart vagabond, looking at Vorthar through the viewport like it had just insulted his mother. "Well, there it is," he muttered, scratching his chin where the stubble threatened to form a rebellion. The planet with the most overhyped tourist attraction in the galaxy. Beside him, his co-pilot Flitz, a sentient amalgamation of what appeared to be mismatched prosthetics and bad decisions, clanked and whirred in agreement. "They say it's a planetary shield," Flitz noted, his voice a mix of static and sarcasm. "It's supposed to be impenetrable," Jaxar snorted. "Impenetrable. Like a politician that doesn't lie, or a drink at a spaceport that doesn't taste like engine grease." He adjusted the controls, bringing the ship closer to Vorthar's orbit. "I've heard the stories. Hell, I'm here to confirm them, or debunk them more likely." The vagabond settled into orbit with a creak that suggested it had lived through more than its fair share of minor asteroid collisions. "Well, don't we look fancy up here?" Jaxar said, glancing at the planet below. "I bet the locals are just lining up to throw us a parade." "Parade of complaints, maybe," Flitz replied, his tone as dry as a desert planet in summer. "Wouldn't be the first time," Jaxar said, running a hand through his hair that was as wild and untamed as a comet on a caffeine high. "Let's see if this shield is as good as they say or if it's just a cosmic placebo. Scans show it's flickering," Flitz reported, tapping at the console like it owed him money. "Like the universe's cheapest light show." Jaxar raised an eyebrow. "Flickering? You mean the thing that's supposed to be protecting everyone down there is having a diva moment?" Flitz nodded, a movement so mechanical it could have been choreographed. "Seems that way. If it fails, the planet's about as safe as a one-legged man in a butt-kicking contest." "Charming," said Jaxar, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Why do I get the feeling this is going to turn into an unpaid overtime situation?" The vagabond slipped through the atmosphere with a hiss of re-entry, and the planet's surface loomed closer. Jaxar squinted at the landscape, all jagged mountains and expansive deserts like a child's drawing of a world seen through a kaleidoscope. "Looks peaceful," he commented. "If your idea of peace includes the possibility of spontaneous planetary incineration," Flitz quipped. Jaxar couldn't help but chuckle. "Oh, come on, we haven't even landed yet." "Give it a chance." The landing zone was a dusty patch of regret and broken dreams, or as the locals called it, a spaceport. As the vagabond touched down with all the grace of a tipsy elephant, Jaxar checked the readings one more time. "Still flickering," he muttered. "This isn't good." Flitz powered down the ship, his eyes, or the technological approximation of them, never leaving Jaxar. "So what's the plan?" "Plan," Jaxar echoed. "You know me, Flitz, I like to wing it. Although in this case I might need a parachute." The ramp lowered with a groan and the planet's dry air hit them like a slap from an angry ex. Jaxar stepped out, shielding his eyes from the unforgiving sun. "Well, at least the weather's nice," he joked. Flitz clanked after him. "Nice like a punch to the gut." "What's next?" Jaxar gestured to the nearest settlement, a cluster of buildings that looked like they were built from the same materials as the local sand dunes. "We find someone who knows why their fancy shield is more indecisive than my ex-wife on her birthday." The settlement was bustling with activity, if by bustling one meant a slow, lethargic shuffle of beings who looked like they were just about ready to throw in the towel. Jaxar approached the first person, or entity. It was hard to tell with the layers of dust and grime, who didn't appear immediately hostile. "Hey, you there," he called out, adopting the universal tone of someone who has no idea what they are doing, but is committed to doing it loudly. "I'm here about your shield." The entity turned, revealing a face that looked like it had been on the losing end of a bar fight with a cheese grater. "Piss off, off-worlder," it grumbled. Jaxar sighed. "Great. Friendly population," he said under his breath. Flitz clanked up to his side. "Didn't you say you wanted to make friends?" "I meant the kind that don't spit on your boots," Jaxar replied, wiping off the offending moisture with a look of disgust. Undeterred, he pushed on, tapping the next person on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he began, only to be met with a glare that could curdle fresh milk. "What do you want?" the person snapped. To help you, Jaxar said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace, or at least the absence of immediate violence. Your shield's acting up and I'm here to figure out why. The person, a hunched figure with a face as wrinkled as a prune that had seen better days, peered at him suspiciously. Why do you care? Jaxar shrugged. Let's just say I have a vested interest in not being vaporized by cosmic radiation. HMPH, the figure grunted. Follow me. They led Jaxar and Flitz through the winding streets, past vendors selling questionable foodstuffs and even more questionable trinkets, until they reached a building that looked slightly less unstable than the others. Inside, the air was cooler, though still ripe with the scent of desperation and burnt coffee. The room was filled with screens and blinking lights, all centered around a single chair, occupied by a figure so thin it seemed they might slip through the cracks in the floor. This is our tech priest, the prune-faced guide said. Jaxar blinked. Tech priest? The figure in the chair turned to face him, revealing a face that looked like it had been pieced together from several discarded parts, and perhaps it had been. Name's Zev, they said, voice crackling like distant thunder. And if you're here to fix my shield, you're dumber than you look. Jaxar grinned. That's a high bar, but I'll take it. Zev gestured to the screens, each showing a different angle of the planetary shield flickering like a dying bulb. It's been like this for weeks. Any idea why? Jaxar asked, leaning in to study the screens. Oh, we have ideas, Zev said. Problem is they all suck. Jaxar chuckled. Welcome to my life. So where do we start? Zev leaned back in their chair, the metal creaking ominously. Start by figuring out who's trying to turn our shield into a fireworks show. Who's in charge here? Jaxar asked, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to step forward and declare themselves the mastermind. In charge, Zev laughed, a sound that was more rasp than mirth. That's funny. No one's in charge, Flitz asked, his mechanical eyebrows rising in surprise. Not since the last leader got tired of the job, Zev replied. Or more accurately, got tired of being alive. Jaxar winced. Sounds like a tough position. Yeah, you could say it's got a high turnover rate, Zev agreed. Jaxar shook his head. So how does anything get done around here? Mostly by accident, Zev said with a shrug. Now, if you're serious about helping, we need to figure out who's messing with the shield and why. Jaxar rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache that promised to be as persistent as a debt collector. Well then, he said, let's start making some enemies. Flitz chimed in, his tone as dry as ever. And here I thought we were here to make friends. Friends, enemies, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference, Jaxar replied, turning to Zev. So, where do we begin? Zev gestured to a console overloaded with data feeds and flickering lights. We start by analyzing the shield's readings. Maybe find a pattern or something that points to who's behind it. Jaxar nodded, rolling up his sleeves with a determination that suggested he might actually know what he was doing. All right, he said, settling in beside the console. Let's see what secrets this flickering nightmare is hiding. As Jaxar delved into the data, Flitz kept watch, his sensors scanning for any sign of trouble. You know, Flitz said, breaking the silence, I never thought I'd spend my days trying to save a planet from itself. Jaxar snorted. And I never thought I'd be working with a walking scraffy, but here we are. Flitz gave a mechanical chuckle. Touché. The hours ticked by, the room filled with the constant hum of machinery and the occasional curse from Jaxar as he hit another dead end. Zev hovered nearby, offering occasional insights that were as sharp as they were cynical. Finally, Jaxar sat back, rubbing his eyes. I've got something, he announced. Zev leaned in, peering at the screen. What is it? A pattern, Jaxar said. Someone's been messing with the shield, but they're doing it in intervals, regular as clockwork. Sabotage, Zev suggested. Jaxar nodded. Looks like it. Somebody wants this shield down, and I bet they're not planning a surprise party. Flitz's sensors beeped, drawing their attention. Incoming transmission, he said, his voice tight with tension. It's not local. Jaxar frowned, checking the readings. From who? The screen flickered, showing a shadowy figure cloaked in darkness. "Greetings," the figure intoned, their voice smooth as silk and twice as slippery. "I hear you're interested in our little operation." Jaxar leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And who might you be?" The figure chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down Jaxar's spine. "Let's just say I'm someone invested in your failure." "Why don't you drop the mysterious act and tell us what you want?" Jaxar challenged. "Oh, I intend to," the figure said, their tone promising nothing good. "But first, let's see if you can survive the next 24 hours." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving Jaxar and the others staring at a blank screen. "Well," Zev said after a moment, "that sounds ominous." Jaxar grinned, though his eyes were dark with determination. "Ominous is just another word for fun, right? If by fun you mean horrifying and probably lethal, then yes," Flitz replied dryly. Jaxar pushed away from the console, standing up with a purpose. "Looks like we've got a planet to save and some chaos to sow. And potentially a mysterious villain to piss off," Zev added. "Wouldn't be the first time," Jaxar said with a smirk. "Let's get to work." Jaxar looked back at the blank screen, sighing like a man who just realized he was sitting on a broken toilet. "Well, if we weren't knee-deep in it before, we're practically swimming in it now." Flitz gave a metallic shrug, the whir of his servos expressing the mechanical equivalent of "I could have told you this would happen." "You'd think by now you'd be used to making more enemies than friends." "That's why I keep you around, Flitz," Jaxar replied, smirking. "Your sunny disposition." Zev, the tech priest, watched their exchange with a bemused expression. "So, you really think someone's sabotaging our shield?" Jaxar nodded, his gaze shifting back to the cracked screen. "It fits. And if there's a conspiracy, there's bound to be a paper trail, or at least a holographic one." Zev gestured around at the banks of screens and consoles. "We've been through all the official records. Nothing but the usual bureaucratic nonsense." "Then we're looking in the wrong place," Jaxar said, crossing the room with purpose. "If I were hiding something, it'd be off the books." Zev raised an eyebrow, metallic fingers tapping against the console. "And where precisely do you propose we find these off-the-books records?" Jaxar grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "Simple. We ask the right people the wrong questions." Flitz sighed, or at least made a noise that suggested he would sigh if he had lungs. "Here we go." Jaxar's patented poke the hornet's nest approach. "You know it works," Jaxar quipped, heading for the door. "Let's find ourselves a hornet." As they emerged from the building, the settlement seemed no less worn, the air still carrying the scent of desperation like an old coat. Jaxar surveyed the bustling, or rather, plodding crowd of locals. "We need to find someone who knows what's going on behind the scenes," he said, scanning the faces for a hint of shadiness. Flitz's sensors pinged softly. "How about that one?" he suggested, nodding toward a figure lurking in the shadows of an alleyway, eyes flicking nervously like a broken traffic light. "Perfect," Jaxar said, striding over with the confidence of a man who'd never been taught the meaning of a bad idea. The figure, a wiry individual with a face that looked like it had been left out in the sun too long, stiffened as they approached. "What do you want?" they hissed, voice as slick as oil on a rainy street. Jaxar held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just a little chat. Word is, there's more going on with that shield of yours than meets the eye." The figure's gaze darted around, searching for an escape route. "I don't know nothin' about no shield." "Of course you don't," Jaxar replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But I bet you know about things people don't want to talk about." The figure hesitated, eyes narrowing. "What's in it for me?" Jaxar leaned in, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "A chance to walk away with more than just a few extra credits in your pocket, and maybe the satisfaction of knowing you're not going to be fried by cosmic radiation." The figure considered this, then jerked their head toward the back of the alley. "Fine. Follow me." Jaxar nodded to Flitz, who clanked along behind them, his sensors scanning for any signs of a trap. They wound their way through narrow alleys until they reached a small, nondescript door. The figure knocked in a rhythm that suggested secret knocks were still in fashion. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with stacks of paper and holographic records. The figure gestured for them to enter, casting a wary glance over their shoulder. "This is as far as I go," they said. "Look for anything marked with the sigil of the Vortharian Council. That's where they hide their dirty laundry." Jaxar stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Thanks," he said, glancing back. "And hey, keep your head down." The figure nodded, vanishing back into the shadows as the door swung shut. Flitz scanned the room, his eyes glowing faintly. "You know, Jaxar, sometimes I forget why I follow you into these situations." "Because you love me," Jaxar replied, already rifling through the papers. "More like I love watching you get into trouble," Flitz retorted, joining him in the search. They worked in silence, flipping through documents with the efficiency of two men who'd played this game before. Jaxar's fingers paused over a stack of papers, his eyes catching a familiar symbol. "Got something," he murmured, pulling the documents closer. Flitz peered over his shoulder. "That looks like the Council's sigil." "Exactly," Jaxar said, scanning the text. "And it looks like they're not as innocent as they'd like us to think." The documents detailed a series of transactions, payments to unnamed parties, references to shield maintenance that seemed more about destruction than repairs. Evidence of a cover-up, plain as day. Jaxar tapped the paper with a finger, as if confirming its solidity. "Looks like someone's been playing both sides. But why sabotage their own shield?" Flitz asked, mechanical brows furrowing. "Could be any number of reasons," Jaxar replied. "Maybe someone stands to gain from the chaos, or maybe it's just good old-fashioned greed wrapped in a new package." Flitz let out a mechanical sigh. "You'd think with all this technology people would learn to behave." Jaxar chuckled darkly. "People and their motives haven't changed since we crawled out of the primordial soup, Flitz. You give someone power, and they'll inevitably try using it to screw over someone else." He folded the documents, tucking them into his jacket. "Let's get this back to Zev. It's not much, but it's a start." As they exited the room, Jaxar couldn't help but glance back, half expecting another twist. But the alley remained silent, the shadows undisturbed, for now. The walk back to Zev felt heavier, each step laden with the weight of what they'd uncovered. As they re-entered the command center, Zev looked up, eyebrow raised in question. "Find anything interesting?" the tech priest asked, a hint of skepticism in their voice. Jaxar tossed the papers onto the console. "Interesting's one way to put it. Looks like your council's been playing a dangerous game." Zev scanned the documents, their expression unreadable. "Sabotage. By our own people. Seems that way," Jaxar said. "Someone's making sure the shield fails, and they're covering their tracks with enough red tape to strangle a bureaucrat." Zev's fingers drummed against the console, eyes fixed on the damning evidence. "This could get us all killed." "It might," Jaxar agreed, leaning back against the console. "But it also might save you from being vaporized." Flitz nodded. "And on the bright side, there's the potential for some thrilling, last-minute heroics." Jaxar shot his co-pilot a look that was equal parts exasperation and amusement. "Always the optimist. So what's the plan?" Zev asked, their tone betraying a mix of hope and resignation. Jaxar crossed his arms, gaze steely. "We find out who on that council's pulling the strings. Then we give him a good, old-fashioned reckoning. And how do you propose we do that?" Zev inquired, skepticism thick in their voice. "With charm, wit, and an unhealthy amount of luck," Jaxar replied, his grin widening. "And maybe a few strategic threats thrown in for good measure." Flitz's servo's word in what could only be described as a mechanical approximation of a sigh. "Why do I get the feeling this is going to end in a firefight?" "Because you know me too well," Jaxar said with a wink. "Now let's go ruffle some feathers." As they set off, Jaxar's mind raced with possibilities, each more dangerous than the last. But beneath the bravado, there was resolve. The kind born from facing the void and laughing in its face. Their first stop was the council chamber, a grandiose name for a building that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. Jaxar pushed open the door, stepping inside with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. A reception desk greeted them, manned by a bored-looking assistant whose expression suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. "Can I help you?" they droned, not looking up from their console. "Yeah," Jaxar said, flashing a grin that had gotten him into more trouble than he cared to admit. "We'd like a word with whoever's in charge of the shield operations." The assistant blinked slowly, as if processing the request through a particularly sluggish server. "Do you have an appointment?" "Not exactly," Jaxar replied, leaning on the desk with casual defiance. "But I think they'll want to hear what we have to say." Flitz stepped up, his presence adding a silent, mechanical menace to the situation. "It's a matter of planetary security," he added helpfully. The assistant glanced between them, weighing the options before reluctantly tapping a few keys. "Wait here." As they stood, Jaxar couldn't resist a wry observation. "You know, Flitz, I think we're starting to make an impression." Flitz emitted a sound that could have been a chuckle. "I'm just waiting for the part where we run for our lives." "Wouldn't be a proper visit without it," Jaxar agreed, scanning the room for potential exits. "Always good to have a backup plan." A few minutes later, a door at the back of the room swung open, revealing a tall, imposing figure clad in the robes of a council official. "You wanted to see me?" they asked, a note of irritation in their voice. "We did," Jaxar said, stepping forward. "Seems like there's been some funny business with your shield and we've got questions." The official's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Concerned citizens," Jaxar replied, flashing another disarming grin. "And potential saviors if you play your cards right." The official's gaze flicked to the documents in Jaxar's hand, recognition sparking in their eyes. "Where did you get those?" "Let's just say your filing system could use some work," Jaxar said. "Now why don't we sit down and have a nice, long chat?" The official hesitated, eyes darting to Flitz, whose silent presence was as reassuring as it was intimidating. "Very well," they said at last. "Follow me." They led Jaxar and Flitz into a small conference room, shutting the door with a decisive click. "You have 5 minutes," the official said, taking a seat. "Convince me not to have you thrown out of here." Jaxar sat opposite them, laying the documents on the table. "We know someone's been monkeying with the shield. We know certain payments have been made to keep it quiet. We just don't know why." The official leaned back, expression inscrutable. "And what do you intend to do with this information?" "Depends," Jaxar said, meeting their gaze. "Are you willing to help us fix the problem, or do we need to find someone else who will?" The official studied him for a long moment, the weight of their decision hanging between them like a guillotine blade. "You realize if you're wrong, this could cost you everything." Jaxar leaned in, eyes dark with purpose. "And if I'm right, it could save your entire planet." Silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. Finally, the official nodded, a reluctant respect in their eyes. "All right, let's see what we can do." Jaxar smiled, though there was no joy in it, only the promise of things to come. "Well then," he said, standing, "let's get to work." As they left the room, Flitz clanked along beside him. "You know, Jaxar, sometimes I almost believe you know what you're doing." "That makes one of us," Jaxar replied with a chuckle. "Now let's go save this rock from itself." They moved with purpose, knowing the stakes, knowing the risks. But beneath the cynicism and the bravado there was hope, fragile, flickering, but real. And sometimes Jaxar thought that was enough. Jaxar Xylo had gotten himself into tighter spots than a beached space whale, but this one was shaping up to be a real classic. As he exited the council building with Flitz clanking loyally at his side, he couldn't help but notice the pair of shadowy figures slipping from the shadows like they were auditioning for a role in the next galactic noir. "Looks like we've attracted some admirers," Jaxar muttered under his breath, quickening his pace without making it obvious. A neat trick in itself, like trying to casually avoid an ex you'd spotted at a party. Flitz's eyes whirred and focused, his sensors always a step ahead. "Admirers or creditors?" "Could be both," Jaxar replied with a shrug. "In this line of work, they're usually interchangeable." The street was littered with the usual detritus of a half-assed frontier settlement, a hodgepodge of stalls selling black market tech, dubious food and souvenirs no sane tourist would want. perfect for blending in, or so Jaxar hoped. He ducked between two stalls, pulling Flitz along with him. "We need a plan," Flitz observed, likely pondering the futility of their situation. His servos whined with what might have been concern. "Plan A. Don't get shot," Jaxar said, glancing over his shoulder. The shadows were tailing them with the kind of dedication you usually only see in separated couples. "Revolutionary," Flitz replied, his voice laced with sarcasm. Jaxar cast around for options, spotting a narrow alley that promised a lesser chance of stumbling into a dead end. They slipped into it like thieves in the night, albeit noisier, given Flitz's less than stealthy metal clanking. "What do you think they want?" Flitz asked, his voice low as they hurried along. Jaxar grinned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Probably to have a chat about our meddling over tea and possibly my spleen on a platter." The alley twisted and turned, gradually opening up to a wider road bustling with more foot traffic. It was a market day, which meant more eyes, more ears, and hopefully a few more escape routes. "Blend in," Jaxar said, tugging Flitz toward a vendor selling what looked like fried rodents. "Act natural." Flitz's head tilted. "Natural, for you or for me?" "Both," Jaxar replied, grabbing a skewer from the vendor and paying with a few credits. An old habit from his days as a street rat, but one that had saved his hide more times than he could count. The cold, wary stare of their pursuers was now like a constant itch at the back of his neck. He needed a distraction, and he needed it fast. Spotting an open manhole cover that led into the city's maintenance tunnels, an idea sparked. "Follow my lead," Jaxar whispered, making a beeline for the opening. He dove down without hesitation, the darkness swallowing him up like a reluctant friend. Flitz followed, albeit with less grace and more clanking. The tunnels were dank, cramped, and smelled like a recycling plant on a bad day, but they were a welcome change from the tension topside. "We should connect to the shield's control systems from here," Flitz noted, his mechanical eyes adjusting to the gloom. "That's the plan," Jaxar said, already searching the walls for an access panel. Every city had its skeletons, and Jaxar had gotten pretty good at rooting them out. As they moved deeper, the air seemed to hum with a low-level vibration, like the planet itself was holding its breath. Jaxar's mind raced, piecing together the jagged edges of information they'd uncovered. "Something big is happening," he muttered. "Bigger than just a bit of sabotage." Flitz's circuits buzzed with thought. "You suspect the shield collapse is intended to invite something?" "Yeah," Jaxar said, prying open a panel with a grunt. "I think someone's rolling out the welcome mat for a cosmic disaster." The panel revealed a tangle of wires and circuits, the kind of mess only a technocrat could love. Jaxar fished out a data spike and jammed it into a port, the screen flickering to life with schematics he could barely understand, but Flitz could. Flitz's processors worked overtime, sifting through the data. "If I'm reading this correctly, and I usually am, there's a cosmic storm headed this way. The kind that levels planets." "Friendly bunch, these saboteurs," Jaxar said, working to dig deeper. "Any idea on the timeline?" Flitz hummed, metaphorically tapping his cybernetic foot. "Soon, too soon." "Great," Jaxar said, yanking the spike free. "Better let Zev know we're on a deadline." Flitz's eyes glowed brighter. "And the shadows, what's the plan if they catch up to us?" "Improvise," Jaxar said, already moving back the way they came. "I'm great at that." They emerged from the tunnels into a back street, the sunlight temporarily blinding. A quick scan of the area revealed no immediate threat, although Jaxar knew better than to relax. They headed toward the stalwart vagabond's last known location, weaving through the crowded streets with a mix of urgency and practiced nonchalance. As they rounded a corner, Flitz's sensors pinged. "Company," he warned. Sure enough, the shadows were back, moving with more determination, like predators who'd caught the scent of blood. Jaxar felt his adrenaline spike, the thrill of the chase almost intoxicating. "Time for Plan B," Jaxar said, slipping into a nearby building with a sign that promised finest entertainment in all of Vorthar. The place was dimly lit, reeking of smoke and stale sweat, a seedy den that was practically a character in its own right. The crowd inside barely noticed their entrance. Most patrons were too engrossed in whatever passed for entertainment on the stage. Jaxar led Flitz to a corner booth, keeping their backs to the wall. "Think we lost them?" Flitz asked, his mechanical voice a whisper. "They're not that lucky," Jaxar replied, scanning the room. "We need another way out of here." The bartender, a grizzled man with a face like a bulldog, gave them a skeptical look as he approached. "You buying or loitering?" "Bit of both," Jaxar said, slipping him some credits. "Looking for a way out that doesn't involve the front door." The bartender pocketed the credits, nodding toward a door behind the bar. "Leads to the old transit tunnels. Watch your step. They ain't been maintained since before the last collapse." "Appreciate it," Jaxar said, standing and motioning for Flitz to follow. As they made their way to the door, Jaxar couldn't help but wonder how many times he'd have to run for his life before the universe cut him some slack. Not that he minded too much. A life without constant near-death experiences would probably bore him to tears. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase, leading down into darkness. Jaxar took the lead, his footsteps echoing as they descended. "I've been meaning to ask," Flitz said as they reached the bottom. "What happens if we fail?" Jaxar paused, the question hanging in the air like smoke. "Then Vorthar gets a cosmic makeover," he said finally. "And we get front-row seats." "You're a real optimist," Flitz observed, his tone dry as desert sands. "It's a gift," Jaxar replied with a grin that was more teeth than warmth. The tunnels were colder than the ones they'd navigated before, the air tinged with the metallic tang of rust and neglect. Jaxar's breath misted as they moved, the sound of dripping water a constant companion. They needed to reach the stalwart vagabond, their only hope of escape if things went south. And given their track record, things going south was a statistical certainty. As they navigated the labyrinthine passages, Jaxar's thoughts drifted to Zev. The tech priest was probably neck-deep in the Council's mess, trying to keep the planet from tearing itself apart. "We need to warn Zev," Jaxar said, keeping his pace brisk. "Get them to rally whatever help they can." Flitz nodded, his servos whirring quietly. "Assuming they're not already overrun by angry bureaucrats with pitchforks." "There's always that," Jaxar acknowledged. "But if anyone can handle themselves in a den of vipers, it's Zev." They emerged from the tunnels near the spaceport, the vagabond sitting like a battered sentinel among the newer, shinier ships. Jaxar felt a surge of relief at the familiar sight, her dented hull a promise of potential escape. "Home sweet home," Jaxar said, leading Flitz aboard. The ship's interior was a chaotic mess of wires and panels, but it was their mess, and that made all the difference. "Think she's up for one more run?" Flitz asked, a mechanical eyebrow raised. "She better be," Jaxar replied, powering up the systems. "Because we're not sticking around to see how this cosmic storm plays out." The vagabond hummed to life, consoles flickering as they ran their pre-flight checks. Flitz took his position at the navigator's seat, fingers dancing over the controls with practiced ease. "Shields are holding, engines are green," Flitz reported, his voice steady. "Ready when you are." "Let's get airborne," Jaxar said, easing the ship off the ground with the care of a father lifting his child. The vagabond responded with a groan, but she lifted, defying gravity's grasp once more. As they rose into the atmosphere, the planet of Vorthar spread out beneath them like a tapestry of chaos. Jaxar couldn't help but feel a pang of regret, knowing the storm heading their way was more than just the weather. "Got a message coming in," Flitz announced, routing it to the main console. The screen flickered and Zev's face appeared, their expression a mix of determination and something that might have been fear. "Jaxar," Zev said, their voice crackling through the speakers. "I trust you're making good use of your head start." "You bet," Jaxar replied, fingers dancing over the controls. "But we've got a problem. Your shield's not just failing, it's being shut down to let a cosmic storm through." Zev swore, a rare occurrence that underscored the gravity of the situation. "We've got saboteurs in the council trying to keep it quiet." If the storm hits full force, then Vorthar's toast, Jaxar finished for them. We need to get the shield back online like yesterday. I'm already working on it, Zev said, their fingers a blur as they tapped on unseen keys. But I'll need time and a distraction to keep the council off my back. Jaxar grinned, a plan forming in his mind. We can do distractions. Flitz, how do you feel about playing decoy? Was that ever in question? Flitz replied, his servos whirring in anticipation. Hold on to your circuits, Jaxar said with a wink, because we're about to give these shadowy bastards a show they'll never forget. As they plotted their course to intercept the saboteurs, Jaxar felt the familiar thrill of the unknown. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and hardly the heroes Vorthar deserved. But sometimes all it took was a couple of misfits and an old ship with a bit of fight left in her. The universe didn't hand out happy endings like candy, but that didn't mean you couldn't snatch victory from the jaws of defeat every once in a while. And with a little luck and a lot of improvisation, maybe they'd even manage to save the day. Or at least not die trying. Jaxar Xylo had a knack for finding trouble, like a magnet attracting a pile of rusty nails. Not that trouble was hard to find on Vorthar. The planet's motto might as well have been "Welcome to Hell, enjoy your stay." As the stalwart vagabond broke through the atmosphere, leaving behind a trail of thick smoke, Jaxar couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a whole lot worse. Any chance we can make a quiet landing? Jaxar asked as Flitz adjusted their vector. Define quiet, Flitz replied, one mechanical eyebrow raised. I'm a fan of explosions and dramatic exits. Yeah, but let's save the theatrics for later. Have to keep something for the encore. The vagabond settled down in a grimy section of the spaceport that was about as welcoming as a grizzly bear with a toothache. They stepped off the ship, blending into the crowd of disreputable types who looked like they'd sell their grandmother for a quick credit. As they made their way through the spaceport, Jaxar spotted Dr. Trellis, a scientist who'd turned into a bit of a conspiracy theorist. Or maybe he'd always been one. Hard to tell on Vorthar. The man was a wiry bundle of nerves, with a lab coat that looked like it hadn't seen a wash since the last cosmic disturbance. Jaxar, Trellis called, waving them over with the enthusiasm of a man who didn't realize he was probably being monitored by half the planet. Trellis, Jaxar acknowledged, shaking the scientist's hand. Still looking for little green men, or have you moved on to cosmic storms now? Trellis chuckled, though it sounded more like a nervous tick. Oh, the green men are old news. Now it's all about the impending doom, you know. I heard about your escapades with the planetary shield. Sounds like a right cluster of problems. You have no idea, Jaxar replied, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. We need access to the government's network. Think you can help? Looking to rattle some cages, are we? Trellis said, his eyes twinkling with a mix of fear and excitement. I can get you in, but security's tighter than a miser's purse. They've got algorithms watching algorithms. Great, just what I needed, Jaxar muttered. An AI arms race with the odds stacked against us. Trellis motioned for them to follow, leading them through the spaceport and into a series of back alleys that stank of refuse and bad decisions. They reached a rundown building that had Hacker's Den written all over it, in a font that screamed keep out to anyone with a sense of self-preservation. Inside, computers and monitors were strewn about like a digital graveyard. Trellis sat at a terminal, fingers flying over the keys like a man possessed. Okay, let's see what we can dig up, he said, the machine humming to life with a soft purr. Jaxar leaned over, watching the lines of code scroll across the screen. Things must be getting bad if they've tightened security. Oh, the government's been in a tizzy, Trellis explained, not taking his eyes off the monitor. They've issued a curfew, locked down communications, even restricted access to public records. You'd think they were trying to hide something. You don't say, Jaxar replied, deadpan. Let me guess, they're also handing out tin-foil hats with every purchase of paranoia. Flitz beeped, an amused static crackling through his circuits. The government's always been good at playing hide and seek. Just not so much at the seeking. Trellis barked a laugh, quickly clamping down on it as he remembered the monitors could be listening. Right, well, the shield schematics should be in this archive. If the saboteurs left a trail, it's here. Minutes stretched into an hour as Trellis sifted through files like a digital archaeologist unearthing forgotten secrets. Jaxar started to pace, his nerves fraying as the enormity of their task settled in. "Got something," Trellis finally said, his voice tinged with triumph. "Looks like there's an off-the-books operation." "Means someone's been monkeying with the shield under everyone's noses." "Who's involved?" Jaxar asked, his heart pounding in time with the code flashing on the screen. Trellis tapped a few more keys, his face falling. "It's encrypted, high-level stuff, but I can tell you this, it smells of the Council." "Council?" Jaxar rubbed his jaw, considering the possibilities. "Guess that explains the bad smell. They are in bed with the saboteurs trying to cover their tracks, and if we push too hard," Flitz mused, "they'll bring the hammer down before we can say oops." "Then we push carefully," Jaxar decided. "Trellis, can you decrypt this?" "I can try," Trellis replied, a hesitant edge to his voice. "But it'll take time. And if they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll have us up against a wall faster than you can say summary execution." "No pressure then," Jaxar said, putting a hand on Trellis's shoulder. "Just work your magic. We need to know who's pulling the strings." As Trellis dove back into the digital ether, Jaxar stepped aside, pulling Flitz with him. "We need to keep low. Government's got eyes everywhere and they're not known for their forgiving nature." "Low profile's not really your thing," Flitz pointed out, his tone neutral yet somehow judgmental. "You might be right," Jaxar admitted, a grin cutting across his face. "But hey, what's life without a bit of risk?" "Boring, that's what." Trellis continued his work while Jaxar and Flitz took turns keeping watch, their eyes skimming the shadows for signs of unwanted company. Hours passed, the tension thick enough to choke on. Finally, Trellis let out a weary sigh. "I'm through the first layer of encryption," he announced, rubbing his eyes. "It's slow going, but there's definitely something here, something big." "Anything actionable?" Jaxar asked, his impatience gnawing at him like a hungry rat. "Not yet," Trellis admitted, "but I'll keep digging." Jaxar nodded, feeling the weight of the world, or at least Vorthar, on his shoulders. "Keep at it. We're running out of time, and I don't fancy our chances against a cosmic storm." The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, the kind of time dilation that only happens when you're waiting for an inevitable disaster. Jaxar couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at being right in the thick of it. If there was one thing he could count on, it was chaos. Suddenly, the building's door burst open, slamming against the wall with a metallic clang. Jaxar spun, instinctively reaching for his sidearm, only to find himself staring down the barrel of a government-issued blaster. "On your feet," the lead officer barked, her tone suggesting she'd attended the yell first. "Ask questions, never school of law enforcement. You're all under arrest for breach of planetary security." Jaxar raised his hands, trying for a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Look, we're just doing some freelance archaeology. Nothing to see here." "Save it," she snapped, gesturing for her team to move in. "You're coming with us." Flitz beeped quietly, a signal of faint alarm, his servos whirring as he calculated possible escape routes. Jaxar remained still, watching as Trellis was hauled to his feet, fear etched into every line of his face. "Well, this went south faster than a comet on jet fuel," Jaxar commented, casting a sideways glance at Flitz. "Always the optimist," Flitz replied, his mechanical voice tinged with sarcasm. As they were led out into the street, Jaxar couldn't help but notice how many people seemed to be watching them. Faces peered out from windows, eyes filled with curiosity and no small amount of schadenfreude. "Guess we're the main attraction," Jaxar quipped, earning himself a shove from one of the guards. "Keep moving," the officer ordered, her grip on his arm like a vice. "Friendly bunch," Jaxar muttered to Flitz, who trundled along beside him. "It's like they think we're public enemy number one." Just be glad they haven't decided to shoot first and ask questions later, Flitz replied, his sensors flicking between the guards and their surroundings. They were marched through the streets like a trio of common criminals, the spaceport shrinking behind them as they entered the governmental district. Jaxar had always thought of the place as a bureaucratic black hole, where hopes and dreams went to die in triplicate. Inside the council building, they were herded into a cramped interrogation room, the kind of place that smelled of sweat and desperation. Jaxar was shoved into a chair, his wrists secured with energy cuffs that hummed with restrained power. "Welcome to Hotel Vorthar," Jaxar said as one of the guards left them to stew. "Please enjoy the complimentary anxiety." "You have a real way with words," Trellis said, his voice shaky. "Not sure it's going to help us much here." "Don't worry," Jaxar replied, settling back as much as the cuffs allowed. "I've been in worse situations." "Really?" Trellis asked, eyes wide. "No," Jaxar admitted, sighing. "But I've been in enough to know we need a plan." Before Trellis could respond, the door swung open, and an officer with a face that could curdle milk strode in. She examined them with the kind of disdain usually reserved for particularly uncooperative stains. "Jaxar Xylo," she said, her voice as sharp as a knife. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long." "Happy to be of service," Jaxar replied, his tone light despite the situation. Her expression darkened. "You think this is funny? You're involved in a conspiracy that threatens this entire planet." "Funny? No," Jaxar said, leaning forward. "But it's hard not to laugh when faced with such staggering incompetence. You've got a cosmic storm heading your way, and your best plan is to arrest the guys trying to stop it. Your activities have endangered the stability of Vorthar," she reiterated, ignoring his jibe. "And if you think you'll get out of this by being clever, think again." "Look, we're trying to help," Trellis interjected, his voice trembling. "If you just let us explain, save it," she cut him off with a wave. "You'll have plenty of time to explain in front of a tribunal." She turned on her heel and left, leaving them alone in the silence that followed. Jaxar glanced at Trellis, who looked like he was about to faint, and Flitz, who was decidedly more stoic. "Well, that went well," Jaxar said, trying for levity even as the weight of their situation settled on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. "If by well you mean we're royally screwed, then yes," Flitz replied, his servos sighing in unison with his tone. Jaxar settled back, his mind racing as he considered their options. They'd been cornered, outmaneuvered, and now faced the full force of the government. But he'd be damned if he'd give up without a fight. "All right," Jaxar said, his voice firm. "We need to think of a way out of this. They've got us in a bind, but we've still got a few tricks up our sleeves." Trellis looked skeptical, which was fair, considering their predicament. But Jaxar knew one thing for certain. If they didn't act soon, Vorthar was going to become a very different place. And not for the better. The door slammed shut behind the officer, leaving Jaxar, Flitz, and Trellis in the cold embrace of the interrogation room. The air was thick with the kind of tension that promised nothing good, like a storm cloud waiting to unleash hell. Jaxar leaned back, the energy cuffs biting into his wrists, and considered their options. There weren't many. "Well, boys, it looks like we're on the government's naughty list," Jaxar said, trying to inject some levity into the situation. "I bet they even have a special file for us. Maybe with our own theme song." Trellis managed a weak chuckle, though it had the conviction of a soggy noodle. "And what would that be?" "Something appropriately funeral-like," Jaxar shrugged. "I was thinking more Stayin' Alive, but with a lot more sarcasm." Flitz, ever the straight bot in their comedy routine, whirred softly. "Might be time to face facts. We're one misstep away from a lifetime supply of cold steel bars." Jaxar shot a look at his mechanical companion. "You always know how to lift my spirits, Flitz. If you get tired of this illegal escapade business, you could make a killing as a motivational speaker." "Only if I wanted my audience to weep uncontrollably," Flitz replied. The lights above flickered ominously, a reminder that the world outside wasn't doing too hot either. The shield was decaying faster than a politician's promise, And if Jaxar and his mismatched crew didn't figure something out soon, Vorthar would get a new crater for a landmark. "We need a plan," Trellis said, his voice a mix of desperation and determination, like a man trying to convince himself he could still win at cards with a hand full of jokers. "Yeah," Jaxar agreed, "preferably one that doesn't end with us on a firing line or in a shallow grave." As if on cue, the door creaked open again, and a different officer entered. This one had a face like someone had carved it out of granite with a particularly blunt chisel. He set a thin folder on the table and sat down, giving them a once-over that suggested he was assessing how much paperwork they'd generate. "Jaxar Xylo," he said, as if the name tasted bitter in his mouth. "You're being charged with conspiracy, sabotage, and endangerment of planetary security." "How do you plead?" "Pleasure to meet you too," Jaxar said, flashing a grin that he hoped seemed more charming than doomed. "I suppose not guilty due to being framed by an inept government won't fly." The officer's expression didn't change. It was like trying to impress a brick wall with interpretive dance. "Your attempts at humor are only making things worse for you," Jaxar shrugged. "Couldn't get much worse, really. We're in a room that smells like fear and leftover takeout. Any chance you could air the place out?" The officer ignored him, turning to Trellis. "And you, care to enlighten us on how you got tangled up with this?" "I was just trying to do some good," Trellis stammered, shifting nervously in his seat. "The shield. The shield is none of your concern," the officer interrupted, his voice as hard as his face. "You're in over your head." Flitz's servos whispered softly, a mechanical sigh. "We seem to be experts at that." The officer tapped the folder, a slow, deliberate action that promised nothing pleasant. "You're going to have a lot of time to think about your choices. I suggest you use it wisely." With that, he stood and left, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the room like a death knell. "Charming fellow," Jaxar commented, turning to Trellis. "You think there's a special training program for how to be that cheerful?" Trellis rubbed his temples. "I don't know, but I'm about ready to sign up for a course in escape artistry." Jaxar chuckled, though it was a hollow sound. "Start with how to dislocate your thumb. I hear that's useful." Flitz beeped. "And what about the small detail of being on a planet-wide wanted list?" "Details, details," Jaxar replied. "We just need to get our story out there. If we can convince the right people, we might still have a shot." Trellis looked doubtful. "And how do you suggest we do that when we're stuck in here?" Jaxar tapped his forehead. "Leave that to me. I've got a couple of contacts who owe me favors. We just need to buy some time." The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. The building's clock ticked along like a mocking reminder of their dwindling chances. Jaxar racked his brains, trying to concoct a plan that didn't end with them as martyrs in a lost cause. Finally, Flitz piped up, his tone a shade more hopeful. "If we can access the public announcement system, we might be able to broadcast a message." Jaxar nodded, considering. "And what? Ask everyone to meet us in the town square for a good old-fashioned protest. Our chances of survival are about the same as a snowball's in a supernova." "True," Flitz conceded, "but we're running out of options faster than an airlock with a faulty seal." "Okay," Jaxar said, leaning forward. "Let's say we get a message out. Then what? The council's got their fingers on every trigger and we're the ones with targets painted on our backs." Trellis frowned, a pensive look on his face. "If we could get the public on our side, maybe we could corner the council into admitting their role in this mess." Jaxar nodded slowly. "We need someone in the public eye, someone who can amplify our message." "Any ideas?" Flitz beeped thoughtfully. "There is the journalist Vanny Talon. She's known for ruffling a few feathers. If anyone can get the word out, it's her." "Vanny it is, then," Jaxar decided. "Let's just hope she's in the mood to take on a rogue government." Hours passed, punctuated by the occasional shuffle of boots outside their door. Jaxar felt the weight of the room pressing down on him, like an invisible hand squeezing the air out of the space. He glanced at his companions, feeling an odd sense of camaraderie. They were all in this mess together. Eventually the door opened and a couple of guards entered. "You too," one of them barked, nodding at Trellis and Jaxar. "On your feet." They were led out, Flitz following behind like a loyal specter. As they walked, Jaxar mulled over their plan. It was flimsy, barely even a plan by the loosest definition, but it was all they had. The guards brought them to a larger room, filled with equipment that hummed and blinked with life. In the center, a console beckoned, seemingly out of place in the sterile environment. It hummed like a contented cat, unaware of the chaos around it. "This is your chance," one of the guards said, a trace of disdain in his voice. "One message, make it count." Jaxar exchanged a glance with Flitz. "Here goes nothing," he murmured, stepping forward. His fingers flew over the console, a blur of motion as he accessed the system. The announcement network was surprisingly easy to tap into, a testament to the government's overconfidence. "Okay, everyone," Jaxar said as his voice echoed through the space. "This is Jaxar Xylo, and I'm here to tell you that your lovely council is about to sell you out to the highest bidder." Trellis watched, eyes wide, as Jaxar continued. "The shield's failing and the council's in bed with the people responsible. We're talking about a cozy arrangement that's about to get you all killed." It was a gamble, but then again, everything about their current existence was a gamble. As the message went out, Jaxar couldn't help but wonder if they just painted bigger targets on their backs. With the message sent, Jaxar leaned back, a grim satisfaction settling over him. It was a small victory, but in a world where victories were rare and fleeting, he'd take what he could get. The guards moved in, ready to haul them back to their cell, but Jaxar felt a spark of defiance. "Hope you enjoy the fireworks," he said, grinning at the guards. "Because one way or another, things are about to get explosive." As they were escorted away, Jaxar allowed himself a moment of reflection. It wasn't the best plan, and it certainly wasn't foolproof, but it was something. And in a place like Vorthar, sometimes something was as good as it got. The stalwart vagabond groaned through space like a drunken whale struggling to dance. Jaxar stood in the cockpit, watching the flickering lights of Vorthar below, the decay of its planetary shield a testament to either divine wrath or monumental incompetence. He wasn't sure which was more terrifying. Next to him, Flitz's servos hummed a mechanical dirge while Trellis fidgeted, looking more like someone who'd just realized they'd been dealt the Joker card in a game they didn't remember joining. "Remind me again," Jaxar said, "how we ended up carting a conspiracy theorist through the cosmos on a ship that's one bad sneeze away from disintegration." Trellis, unkempt hair sticking out at odd angles, shrugged, perpetually nervous. "You know the usual. Planetary doom, government betrayal, life on the edge. Not to mention a hefty dose of blind optimism." "Ah, optimism," Jaxar said, "the refuge of the delusional." The cockpit door slid open with an arthritic screech, and Zev entered, his robe flowing like a ceremonial curtain at an unholy marriage. He surveyed the trio, eyes narrowing. "I hope you three have a plan that extends beyond sitting here until everything implodes." "Of course," Jaxar replied, feigning offense. "We're going to discover ancient technology, save the planet, and probably win a Nobel Prize for best improvised heroics." "Fascinating," Zev deadpanned. "And where exactly do you plan to find this technology?" "The bargain bin at the local superstore." Jaxar pointed to a holographic map glowing on the console. "There's a sector in the ruins below that looks promising. Old wreckage, forgotten tech, all the makings of a legend or a suicide mission, but let's try to stay positive." Zev crossed his arms. "You do realize that anything left down there is likely either looted or lethal." "Just the way I like things," Jaxar said. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a date with Destiny, assuming Destiny doesn't cancel last minute." The vagabond shuddered into descent, navigating through the debris field like a drunk weaving through traffic. Jaxar couldn't help but think that if they survived this, he might just apply for sainthood, or at least get a decent write-up in the local papers. As they neared the surface, the landscape came into grim focus. Twisted metal and shattered buildings poked out of the ground like grave markers for civilizations past. This was Vorthar's legacy, an ancient world clinging desperately to relevance as it crumbled to dust. Jaxar and Trellis suited up, the latter muttering nervous prayers under his breath. Flitz remained silent, though his circuits buzzed with anticipation or indigestion. It was always hard to tell. "All right, team," Jaxar said, slapping his helmet on. "This is it. Our chance to make history, or at least not become a footnote." The airlock hissed open, spilling them onto Vorthar's surface. The ground was a desolate mix of scorched earth and rusted ruins, the kind of place that screamed bad idea to anyone with functioning eardrums. Jaxar took a deep breath, which, through the suit's filters, tasted like stale dreams and regret. They trekked through the ruins, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of their boots on debris and Flitz's occasional beep of discontent. Trellis' anxiety was palpable, a near-tangible fog surrounding him. "So," Trellis said, attempting conversation to fill the void, "what exactly are we looking for?" "Anything that screams forgotten tech with improbable world-saving potential," Jaxar replied. "Or, failing that, a decent cup of coffee." The group halted before a massive structure that loomed like a forgotten god. Its surface was pocked and gouged, a testament to the ravages of time and neglect. An ominous feeling settled over them, the kind you get when you realize you've got a spin on the roulette wheel with everything on the line. Jaxar approached a panel set into the wall, the remnants of some ancient locking mechanism. "All right, Flitz, show us what you got." With a whir and a click, Flitz extended a manipulator, interfacing with the panel. The mechanism groaned in protest, but slowly the door began to slide open with all the enthusiasm of a sloth on sedatives. Inside, the air was stale, the shadows thick and unwelcoming. Consoles and machinery lined the walls, their purpose lost to time. Jaxar stepped forward, the feeling of potential thrumming in his veins like an unsung melody. Trellis held up a scanner, the device chirping as it registered the surroundings. "There's a power source here," he said, a glimmer of hope breaking through his usual cloud of pessimism. "Something still operational." "Excellent," Jaxar said. "Let's hope it's not a self-destruct mechanism." They moved deeper into the facility, the only sound the echo of their footsteps and the occasional mechanical cough from Flitz. The central chamber was vast, a cathedral of technology where ancient and modern clashed. In the center, a console hummed with a faint, inviting glow. "This is it," Jaxar said, approaching the device. "Our holy grail." Trellis joined him, his eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and awe. "Can it really stabilize the shield?" Jaxar shrugged. "Only one way to find out." Trellis, care to do the honors? Trellis hesitated, then stepped forward, fingers trembling as they danced over the console like nervous butterflies. The machine came to life, lights flickering as dormant systems roared back to existence. A holographic display erupted from the console, a cascade of data and diagrams flowing around them. Jaxar squinted at the information, trying to make sense of it all. "Looks like we've got ourselves a shot," he said, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "This tech can stabilize the shield, but it needs to be synchronized with the planetary core." "Easy peasy," Trellis said, sarcasm masking his anxiety. "We'll just waltz on over and plug it in like a toaster," Jaxar grinned. "Exactly, nothing to it, except the part where we probably die trying." Flitz emitted a noise that might have been laughter or perhaps just static interference. An adventure worthy of legends or of a particularly tragic comedy. They worked quickly, their movements a blurred ballet of desperation and determination. Jaxar felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that they might just pull off the impossible. Finally, Trellis stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's ready," he said, voice a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Jaxar nodded, feeling the gravity of the situation settle over him like a shroud. "Then let's get this done. We broadcast the synchronization signal and pray to whatever deity hasn't given up on us yet." As they returned to the surface, the vagabond hovered above like a faithful hound waiting for its master. The ship's gangplank extended, offering refuge from the encroaching doom. Once on board, Jaxar wasted no time, activating the synchronization process. The ship systems hummed in response, the console displaying the status of the planetary shield in real time. "Here goes nothing," he murmured, initiating the sequence. The vagabond shuddered, energy coursing through its systems as the synchronization began. The entire ship seemed to hold its breath, the moment stretching out like a taut wire. Jaxar watched the display, heart pounding. He felt the pull of fate, the sense that every decision had led them to this moment. The shield indicator flickered, then stabilized, a steady pulse of light that spoke of hope and salvation. "We did it," Trellis whispered, disbelief coating his words. "We actually did it." "Yeah," Jaxar said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Against all odds, we might just live to regret our choices." Flitz beeped in agreement. "A victory worth celebrating, even if it means we'll have to find new ways to risk our necks." The vagabond ascended, leaving the ruins behind as they soared into the sky, the shield below flickering back to life. Jaxar let himself relax, the tension draining from his body. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a fighting chance. Even on a planet as doomed as Vorthar, human resilience had managed a small miracle. As they flew toward the horizon, Jaxar couldn't help but smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a universe that seemed hell-bent on their destruction, something was a damn good start. Jaxar stood in the vagabond's cockpit, staring at the console with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for a tax audit. The planetary shield was stabilized, for now, flickering with a consistency that should have been reassuring. But in his line of work, stability was often just the calm before the universe kicked you in the face. Trellis leaned over, his unkempt hair doing a fair imitation of a bird's nest. "We've bought some time," he said, his voice quivering like a reluctant opera singer. "But it's only temporary." "Temporary is my middle name," Jaxar replied. "Well, actually, it's Percival, but that never looked good on a wanted poster." Zev, who had been lurking in the doorway like an unwelcome specter at a family reunion, finally spoke up. "So what's the plan now, O fearless leader?" "Simple," Jaxar said, the sarcasm dripping from his words like oil from a broken ship. "Expose the government's plot, save the planet, and maybe squeeze in a nap, all before lunch." "Good to see you've considered your priorities," Zev deadpanned. Flitz, with servos humming a dissonant symphony of concern, interjected. "The data we uncovered indicates the government intended to let the shield collapse. They'd profit from the chaos of an interstellar conflict. And here I thought politicians were only good for robbing us blind," Jaxar quipped. "Turns out they're also keen on planetary genocide." Very versatile. Trellis, his face pale under the fluorescent lighting, looked like he'd just gotten the bad news that the apocalypse had been rescheduled for tomorrow. "But why?" "Because," Jaxar said, leaning back in his seat with a sigh, "when civilizations go to hell, there's always someone selling tickets to the show." And they wanted front-row seats. He flicked through the data on the console, the holographic display painting grim pictures of betrayal and greed. It was all there. Financial transactions, secret communications, and a list of officials who wouldn't look out of place in a villain's hall of fame. "Well, this is charming," Jaxar muttered. "They plan to let the shield fail, blame it on the neighboring systems, and swoop in with military contracts. It's a classic play: chaos, control, cash, the 3 C's of interstellar politics." Zev snorted. "And here I thought they were just incompetent. Turns out they're maliciously competent." "So what's the move?" Trellis asked, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the console. "We broadcast the information," Jaxar said, as if it were that simple. "Expose the bastards. Make sure everyone from here to the outer rims knows what they're up to." "And how do you propose we do that?" Zev asked, his skepticism as thick as his robe. "Last I checked, our communication system's range is about as impressive as a rubber band." Jaxar grinned, a flash of teeth that promised trouble. "We borrow someone else's. The spaceport's got a long-range transmitter. We tap into it, send the data, and sit back as the fireworks start. Flitz buzzed in agreement. It's risky, but with the right approach, it can work. Risky is my middle name, Jaxar said again, then paused. Wait, I think I used that joke already. Damn, Trellis, looking as if he was about to volunteer for a suicide mission, which, considering their odds, wasn't far off the mark, nodded. We'd better move fast. If they catch wind of this, we're toast. Toasted toast, Jaxar corrected. But yeah, let's move. The Vagabond set course for the spaceport, its engines groaning like an old man rising from a too-soft chair. Jaxar watched the planet's surface blur past, the ruins below a reminder of how easily things can fall apart when humanity's at the helm. As they approached the spaceport, he couldn't help but notice the increased security presence, a detail he chose to disregard with the kind of optimism that would make drunk gamblers proud. Looks like the welcome party's out. Strange, Zev said, peering through the viewport. I didn't realize bounty hunters threw such elaborate parades, Jaxar shrugged. They do love a good chase, makes them feel alive. They landed with a thud, the Vagabond settling onto the grimy tarmac with all the grace of a brick in a tumble dryer. Jaxar powered down the engines, the ship's systems whirring into silence. All right, he said, unbuckling himself. Let's make it quick. In, out, and hopefully not in a body bag. The spaceport was its usual charming self, grime, grit, and the faint odor of desperation. Jaxar led the way, weaving through the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent way too much time dodging creditors and rivals. They reached the transmitter station, a facility that looked like it had been designed with the express purpose of depressing architects everywhere. A pair of guards stood at the entrance, eyeing them with the suspicion of cats spotting an unfamiliar dog. Time for Plan B, Jaxar whispered. What was Plan A? Trellis asked, genuinely curious. Don't get caught, Jaxar replied. Plan B is improvise. Zev rolled his eyes. Oh, good. My favorite kind of plan. With a nod to his companions, Jaxar approached the guards, putting on his best trust me, I'm not a threat face. All right, gents, we're here to check the equipment. Some sort of maintenance issue, I'm told. You know how these things are, breakdowns more common than a politician's lies. The guards exchanged glances, the kind of look that indicated their combined intelligence was on par with a toaster's. We weren't told about any maintenance. Shocking, isn't it? Jaxar said with a theatrical sigh. The communication in this place is worse than a teenage romance. Look, you can call it in if you want. But if this thing goes down, guess who will come asking questions? And I'm not talking about the friendly kind. The guards hesitated, uncertainty warring with their love for an easy life. After a moment of internal deliberation that probably took all their brain power, they stepped aside. Much appreciated, Jaxar said, tipping an imaginary hat as they walked past. I'll make sure to mention your cooperation in my report. Once inside, Flitz got to work, his mechanical fingers a blur as he interfaced with the terminal. The room buzzed with the hum of machines and the distant clamor of the port, a symphony of chaos that was oddly comforting in its predictability. Got it, Flitz said. We're in, ready to transmit. Jaxar nodded, adrenaline spiking through his veins. All right, let's light this candle. Trellis initiated the transmission, the data streaming out across the stars. It was a bold move, a beacon of truth in a galaxy where deception was the currency of the realm. Let's hope someone's listening, Trellis murmured, watching the progress bar with the intensity of a gambler watching a roulette wheel. They'd better be, Jaxar said, his tone more hopeful than he felt. Because if this doesn't work, we're fresh out of ideas and probably out of luck. Flitz beeped as the transmission completed. Message sent. Now we wait. Jaxar leaned back, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on him. It was out of their hands now, their fate suspended in the ether as they waited for the stars to align, or explode, as was often the case. The silence stretched, a taut wire of tension that threatened to unravel at any moment. Jaxar's mind buzzed with the possibilities, each one more improbable than the last. But amidst the chaos, he found a perverse sense of peace. They'd done all they could, and in a galaxy that thrived on the improbable, sometimes that was enough. "I guess now we play the waiting game," Zev said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Which, as we all know, is never as fun as it sounds. Especially when the stakes involve the small matter of our survival," Jaxar replied, his tone dry as a desert. Minutes ticked by, each one an eternity in the waiting. And then, breaking through the anxiety like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds, came the notification they'd been praying for. "Incoming transmission," Flitz announced, his voice tinged with the electric excitement of a well-tuned circuit. "It's a response to our broadcast." Jaxar's heart leapt into his throat, hope and fear mingling like old acquaintances. He activated the console, watching as the message materialized, a formal address from a council of neighboring systems. The message was brief, but its implications were vast. The council had received their transmission, reviewed the evidence, and were mobilizing a response. They wouldn't let Vorthar fall, nor would they stand by as the government's plot unfolded. "They're onto it," Trellis said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. "They're actually going to intervene." Jaxar felt a wave of emotion crash over him, a cocktail of triumph and exhaustion. "Looks like we might just make it through this after all. Or at least live long enough to find new ways to screw up," Zev added. As they prepared to leave, the spaceport's atmosphere shifted, a palpable tension replaced by a sense of anticipation. The universe had heard their plea, and for once it seemed inclined to listen. Jaxar, for all his cynicism and sarcasm, allowed himself a moment of optimism. It wasn't much, but in the grand scheme of things it was enough. They'd exposed the conspiracy, stabilized the shield, and in doing so, set the wheels of justice in motion. "Well," Jaxar said, turning to his companions with a grin that was equal parts relief and mischief, "I'd say this calls for a celebration. Drinks are on me, if we ever find a bar that accepts whatever passes for currency in this corner of the galaxy. Assuming we survive long enough to enjoy them," Trellis replied, a hopeful smile breaking through his usual anxiety. "Yeah," Jaxar said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But hey, survival's just another word for we didn't completely cock it up this time." As they made their way back to the Vagabond, the future stretched out before them, a tapestry of uncertainty and possibility. But for now, they'd earned a moment to breathe, to celebrate their small victory against the odds. And in a universe that rarely handed out happy endings, that was worth its weight in stardust. Jaxar Xylo stood in the middle of the stalwart Vagabond's cockpit, staring out at the mess they'd made of Vorthar's skies. The once pristine blue now looked like someone had taken a hacksaw to a Monet painting. But that's what happens when you expose a government conspiracy, chaos, and not the fun kind. "Who knew collapsing a government could be so messy?" Jaxar quipped, leaning against the console with an exaggerated sigh. "I was expecting more ticker tape, fewer riots," Flitz words sympathetically, his mechanical eyes flickering with what might pass for concern. The probability of civil unrest was calculated at 98.7%, a commendable near certainty for chaos, thanks Flitz. "Always comforting," Jaxar replied with a sarcastic nod. "Just what I need. A walking statistics manual." Trellis, looking even more disheveled than usual, wiped a greasy hand on his coat. "Well, at least we've got the council's attention now. I think they're more scared of us than motivated by civic duty. Scared of us." Zev chuckled, leaning against the bulkhead. "We're about as frightening as a wet sponge. Unless they've got a phobia of poorly maintained spaceships." Jaxar grinned at that, the dark humor sitting well in his chest. "Hey, don't knock it. Our charm lies in our ability to screw things up in the most unpredictable ways." The Vagabond's cockpit felt like a safe haven, even with the world falling apart around them. It was cramped, the air tinged with the smell of burnt circuits and desperation, a fitting aroma for a crew more accustomed to running than saving planets. "All right," Jaxar said, pushing off the console. We've got a new to-do list, folks. First up, let's make sure that shield doesn't flicker out and fry us all. Flitz swiveled towards the console, his servos buzzing with purpose. Initiating diagnostics. We'll need to patch the shield's energy source and recalibrate its output. It's delicate work, delicate. Jaxar chuckled. Delicate is trying to shave in zero-G with a hangover. This is more like disarming a bomb in a hurricane. Just the way we like it, Zev added, arms crossed. If it's not life-threatening, it's not worth doing. Trellis tapped away at his handheld device, his brow furrowed. I'll coordinate with the Council's tech teams. Hopefully, they've got someone who actually knows their way around ancient tech. Remind me again why we let the government build the shield out of parts that look like they belong in a museum. Zev asked, voice dripping with sarcasm. Because no one else was dumb enough to try, Jaxar said with a shrug. And you know what they say, never underestimate the power of human stupidity. With that, they set to work. The vagabond systems hummed with renewed life as they coordinated the repair efforts with the Council's tech teams. It wasn't easy, nothing ever was, but at least they weren't under fire. Yet, the shield's diagnostics flashed across the screen, a confusing mess of numbers and algorithms. Jaxar hated math on a good day, and this was decidedly not a good day. Still, they pushed on, Flitz's precise instructions guiding them through the technological labyrinth. Minutes turned to hours, each one filled with the kind of tension that made you want to laugh or cry, or both, at the absurdity of it all. Jaxar felt the weight of the world, quite literally, pressing down on him. One wrong move and the whole thing could come crashing down. Well, I think we've managed not to screw it up entirely, Jaxar said, rubbing the back of his neck, which by our standards is a roaring success. Zev glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. I'm not sure whether that's reassuring or terrifying. Why not both? Trellis offered, his nervous energy still apparent but slightly more subdued. At least we've got a fighting chance now. The shield flickered, a momentary lapse that sent a shiver through their collective spines. But it held, the stabilizers kicking in just in time to prevent total catastrophe. Flitz, how's it looking? Jaxar asked, not bothering to hide the anxiety in his voice. It's stable, Flitz replied, his voice devoid of the usual mechanical cheer. For now. But periodic maintenance will be crucial. This is a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. Temporary is all we ever get, Jaxar said, his tone resigned. But hey, if it keeps us breathing, I'll take it. The vagabond's comms crackled to life, the voice of a council representative cutting through the static. Jaxar Xylo, this is Councillor Myron. We've received your data and are enacting measures to stabilize Vorthar. Your actions have been unexpectedly beneficial, unexpectedly beneficial. Zev chuckled, shaking his head. We save their skins and all we get is unexpectedly beneficial. Let it go, Zev, Jaxar said with a grin. It's more gratitude than I expected. The conversation with the council was brief, but it ended with a promise of continued support and resources for the shield's maintenance. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was more than they could have asked for. As the comms went silent, Jaxar leaned back and let out a long breath. They'd done it. Somehow, against all odds, they'd pulled it off. Well, for now, anyway. Guess we're heroes, Trellis said, a note of disbelief in his voice. Never thought I'd live to see the day. Heroes, us? Jaxar shook his head. We're just idiots with a cause. Heroes wear capes or shiny armor, not grease-stained flight suits. But we did something good, Flitz added, his servos clicking softly. And that's worth celebrating, true enough, Jaxar admitted, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Let's just hope we can keep this up. Preventing planetary doom's not exactly a one-and-done kind of deal. Zev clapped him on the back. Well, if we're gonna keep saving the universe, we'd better get used to flying by the seat of our pants. With the immediate crisis averted, the crew of the stalwart vagabond turned their attention to the future. The repairs to the shield were ongoing, and they'd need all the help they could get to keep it from failing again. But for now, they'd earned a moment of respite. As they floated above Vorthar, the planet slowly regaining its stability, Jaxar took a moment to reflect. They were a ragtag team of misfits and outcasts, but somehow they'd managed to make a difference. "Hey, Jaxar," Zev called, breaking the silence. "You ever think about what we'll do after all this after?" Jaxar replied, brow furrowed. "You mean when we're not neck-deep in trouble yet?" "Assuming we get there," Zev said with a chuckle. Jaxar considered it for a moment, the thought both foreign and appealing. "I dunno, maybe open a bar. Or a nice little farm on some backwater moon where no one's trying to kill us." "Sounds boring," Trelly said, joining the conversation. "But I suppose a little boredom wouldn't be the worst thing." "We'll see," Jaxar said with a shrug. "For now, let's just focus on keeping this rock in one piece." As the Vagabond continued its orbit, Jaxar allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. They'd exposed the plot, saved the planet, and given humanity a fighting chance. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was theirs. And in the grand scheme of things, that was enough. At least for now.